Ever wonder why Vikings are so much more than just horned helmets and epic battles? Well, here's the truth. The real Vikings were world travelers, traders, and even farmers, and they did way more than raid. But here's the kicker. Some of the most shocking things about them might change everything you thought you knew. Stick around to find out how. When you think of Vikings, your mind probably jumps to images of ships on stormy seas, swords clashing, and wild warriors with battle axes in hand. But what if I told you the Vikings weren't just warriors? What if their history is filled with surprise after surprise? That could totally flip how we think about them today. In this video, we're diving deep into the Vikings, their daily lives, their inventions, their culture, and we're about to explore facts that will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about this iconic group of people. You'll be amazed at how much more they achieved beyond the typical Viking stereotype, and you may even end up feeling sorry for how we've misunderstood them all these years. For centuries, Vikings have been painted as nothing more than savage invaders, but that doesn't even come close to telling the full story. Sure, they raided, but they were also some of the most advanced people of their time. So why do we only remember them as barbarians? Why are we stuck on this one-sided view of Viking history? Well, to be honest, a lot of it has to do with how history was written. The Vikings themselves weren't ones to leave behind a lot of written records, but their enemies did. And let's just say their enemies didn't exactly paint the Vikings in the most flattering light. So, we're left with the image of these fearsome raiders while we completely overlook their achievements as explorers, farmers, artists, and more. Let's take a fresh look at the Vikings and uncover a side of them that history often leaves out. Are you ready to break away from the old stereotypes? Let's get into it. Let's start with what you probably already know. The Vikings came from Scandinavia, a region made up of what we know today as Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. And yes, they did raid especially between the 8th and 11th centuries, but that's only one part of their story. In fact, the term Viking didn't even mean raider. It originally referred to someone who went on an expedition or voyage, which means it could have been used for someone going to trade, explore, or even settle down somewhere new. A Viking was more of an identity tied to adventure than just a simple description of someone who looted villages. This brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of Viking life. They were pioneers of maritime technology. We often associate the Vikings with longships, and for good reason. They were some of the best shipbuilders of their time. But what many people don't realize is just how incredible these ships really were. Viking longships were designed for speed, agility, and durability. They could travel across both open sea and rivers, and they were able to navigate waters as shallow as just a foot deep. That meant that they could access places that other ships couldn't even dream of getting to. It wasn't just about raiding, it was about exploration too. Vikings could sail down rivers into Europe, setting up trade routes and creating settlements all along the way. Some historians even believe that Vikings reached North America around the year 100, almost 500 years before Christopher Columbus ever set foot there. But here's where things get interesting. Despite their impressive travels, many people still think of the Vikings primarily as bloodthirsty invaders. Sure, they did attack monasteries and villages, but they also had a deep connection to trade and culture. These warriors didn't just loot, they also built, bargained, and forged relationships with other cultures. They established trade networks stretching from the British Isles all the way to the Middle East. And they weren't just interested in buying and selling ordinary things, they were after exotic goods, like silk, spices, and fine metals. So, when we talk about the Vikings, it's important to remember that they weren't just ruthless raiders. They were also savvy traders who helped connect different parts of the world long before the so-called Age of Exploration. But here's where things get really mind-blowing. You're probably thinking of the classic Viking image: big, burly warriors with long beards, fur cloaks, and horned helmets. Well, guess what? The whole horned helmet thing? It's a myth. The real Viking helmets were simple, iron, and functional. They didn't have horns. The idea of horned helmets comes from 19th century artists, not history. In fact, there is no solid archaeological evidence that horned helmets were ever worn by the Vikings. Now, you might be asking, so, if Vikings didn't wear horned helmets, what did they look like? Well, the real Viking helmet was much more practical and much less dramatic. It was a simple, rounded iron cap with a nose guard. These helmets were designed to protect, not to look impressive in battle. And while they might not have had the iconic horned helmets, Vikings were actually a lot more stylish than you think. They were skilled in creating intricate jewelry, clothing, and even beauty products. Vikings were known for their grooming habits. They were some of the cleanest people of their time, regularly washing and combing their hair. In fact, archaeological digs have uncovered Viking combs, razors, and even eyebrow scissors. These weren't just warriors. They were also meticulous about their appearance. If anything, this just proves how misunderstood they are. Now, let's talk about their society. Most people think that all Vikings did was raid, but that's far from the truth. Many Vikings were farmers, fishermen, and traders who built their communities from the ground up. The Viking Age was also a time of incredible advancements in agriculture. The Vikings developed new farming techniques that allowed them to grow crops in the harsh Scandinavian climate. And it wasn't just about survival. They were making use of every available piece of land to support large, growing populations. They even built longhouses, which were the central gathering places in their communities. These longhouses weren't just places to sleep. They were hubs of social interaction, with families gathering together to share meals and stories. If you lived in a Viking village, your longhouse would be where the action happened. And let's not forget about the Viking legal systems. Believe it or not, the Vikings were one of the first civilizations to have a parliament-like system. They called it the Althing, and it was founded in Iceland in the year 930. The Althing was a gathering of chieftains and free men where laws were made, disputes were settled, and justice was handed out. It's often considered one of the earliest examples of democratic governance. So, while the image of Vikings may bring to mind violent battles and raids, their society was actually fairly structured and governed by laws. But let's take a moment to talk about their religious beliefs. You probably already know that the Vikings had gods like Odin, Thor, and Freyja. But what about their rituals and beliefs? For the Vikings, their gods were not just mythological figures. They were deeply tied to the everyday lives of the people. The Vikings believed in fate, and their worldview was shaped by the idea of an interconnected web of life that influenced everything they did. They practiced rituals that involved offerings and sacrifices to their gods, and many Viking graves have been found with items meant to help the deceased in the afterlife. This wasn't just about worship, it was about a deeper connection to the world around them. Now, here's something you might not know. Viking women had way more freedom and power than women in other parts of the world at the time. You might have assumed that women in Viking society were stuck at home, looking after the household while the men went off to battle. But actually, Viking women had significant rights and freedoms. They could own property, inherit land, and even get divorced if they weren't happy in their marriages. In fact, Viking women played a crucial role in the Viking economy, managing farms and businesses when the men were away. Some even fought alongside the men. Ever heard of Lagertha? She was one of the most famous Viking shield maidens, known for leading warriors into battle. So, women were no strangers to the warrior life. Viking women could be warriors, leaders, and landowners, roles that weren't often afforded to women in other parts of the world. And speaking of battles, Viking funeral traditions were just as fascinating as their battles. When a Viking died, they were often sent off in a dramatic fashion. One of the most iconic funerals involved sending the deceased out to sea in a boat that was set on fire. But here's the twist. While many people think this was the standard Viking funeral, it wasn't as common as you might think. What was more common was a burial in a grave. And these graves often contained all sorts of valuable items like weapons, jewelry, and even animals. These items were believed to be useful in the afterlife, helping the deceased on their journey to the next world. So, the Vikings weren't just bloodthirsty warriors like the myths tell us. They were explorers, traders, farmers, and even pioneers of modern legal systems. They had a rich and complex culture, and their impact on the world is still felt today. From their advanced ships to their social systems, the Vikings were much more than the stereotype we've been fed for so long. They were ahead of their time in more ways than one. The Viking Age wasn't just a time of raids, it was a time of cultural exchange, innovation, and exploration. The Vikings' legacy is one that extends far beyond the battlefield, and it's about time we recognize them for all they contributed to the world. If you found this surprising, make sure to subscribe and check out the next video, where we explore more amazing points in time.